He asked God, right? They asked the Lord answered, and then when the Lord answered, they praised the Lord. I want to be very clear. They didn't trust the Lord because he answered. They trusted him before he answered. They trusted him. They pled with him. He answered. They praised. So they weren't like, oh, now I really know who you are because you answered me. No. Then they were like, Lord, you are the most amazing, powerful, wonderful thing that has, right? They praised him. They lifted him up. They honored him and glorified. Welcome to day 220 of Bible 365. You guys, I am your host, Kathy Carter, and I'm reading through the Bible in 365 days in chronological or historical order. I'm using what's called the Chronological Bible Reading Plan from oneyearbibleonline.com. They have a whole bunch of reading plans, so you would go on, download your chronological reading plan. Print it up. It's a free printable, and you can just use that with your own Bible, or they have Bibles for purchase as well. So if you've coming here for the very first time, you've never been with me before, I just share what's going on in the reading. Best case scenario, how it relates to today, how it related to the time then, how it relates to today now, how we can use that in our life, why it matters, how to strengthen your relationship with the Lord, right? And I'm hoping that you're coming to some of those conclusions on your own as you read it as well. I'm hoping, especially now, 220, we're way beyond halfway. And so I'm hoping at this point, things are lighting up. God is starting to become a little bit more real to you, right? You're starting to really understand the whole primary purpose of why he did what he did, and then how that affects what he does in the future. So if you're reading or with me, you probably are following Christ. I'm going to assume somebody just started mowing the lawn. Hopefully it's not too distracting. But if you are with me, you probably are a follower of Christ. And so I hope what this does is strengthens your understanding of following Christ and the importance of it. All of that being said, we are here today, and it is August 7th, day 220. Our reading today is Daniel 2 and 3 and Jeremiah 7 through 8:3. So we left off yesterday in Daniel. Daniel is a prophet. Okay, so here's where we are in the world. It's about 600 BC. The world has taken Israel and Assyria. There are these massive nations. Israel, did I say Assyria? Israel and Judah. There are these massive nations, Assyria and Babylon, and they're really these huge kingdoms in the Middle Eastern area that have taken over all of the land, basically all through the Mesopotamia, all the way down into Egypt, right? So they've taken over a huge amount of area. Israel was not, the entire nation of Israel was not following the Lord. So one nation at a time, God allowed and even strengthened and lifted up these other nations in order to take down his people, because his people are not following him. And I know that his people aren't following him, even though I wasn't there, because he says it in here, and he says it over and over and over again. And he even gives a lot of the examples of what they do. And we're going to see some more of that today. So we're going to start in Daniel. Daniel was one of the people who was taken into slavery in Babylon, right? So Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, which we'll eventually know as Belteshazzar, who's Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And I don't know if they're in the right order or not. But because they were given new names. And so he took them, and they were like young and attractive and smart and able to learn more and able to do things. And so they were placed inside the kingdom of Babylon, right? So Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king at the time, took them and sort of like, I'm sure he did, and I'm sure his people did, but let's just say took them and used them as people in the kingdom, right? Slowly probably trying to convert them to his way of thinking, right? So then he has more people in his kingdom that are experienced and that are good for them, and that will really prevail over the rest of the world, right? Like, this is what they're looking for. They held really fast to the Lord, these four guys. And so what we saw in the beginning is Daniel essentially said, hey, I know you want to give us this food, but we'd rather eat more to what our God wants us to eat. So just give us vegetables, see how that works out. And if that's good, then we want to stick with doing that. It wound up working out, and they left them alone as far as making them eat what everyone else was eating. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to see what comes after this. Okay. because Daniel could see visions and dreams, right? So he had visions and dreams and he could interpret them. So here we go. We're in Daniel 2, and it starts out in the second year of his reign. So this is the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign with the people of Judah. He had dreams. Like many of us, he had dreams. His dreams were kind of eating at him. He felt like they meant something. And so he pulled all of his people. And if you have been with me, I am hoping, right? Because this is how, and I've said this probably more than one time, but everyone asks, why these books in the Bible, right? Like, who gets to say that these are the books that make it in the Bible? And I'm going to say we see connections. God makes these connections and they spring to life as you're reading these books. This, I'm hoping, may draw you back to Genesis, right? Where Joseph was in jail. Obviously, he's not in jail, but was in jail and was interpreting dreams. And then he got brought to Pharaoh and interpreted Pharaoh's dream, right? So I'm hoping that rang a bell. If it didn't, that's my whole purpose of going backwards, right? Not going forwards, but going backwards, because we get to see what happened, because we've been there. We read that. We did that chapter. So I'm hoping you can see how maybe they, I balance each other out is the word I want to use, but that's not what the word, how they connect, right? So God's making himself obvious, I think. Okay, so the king summons all the magicians, brings them all in, and they said, okay, tell us what your dream is, and then we'll interpret it. And he says, nope, that's not good enough for me. What needs to happen is you need to tell me my dream, and then you need to interpret my dream. And if you don't do that, I'm going to kill all of you. That's pretty extreme, right? So this was obviously bugging him, and he obviously thought there was some kind of deep meaning to this dream. All right, so, and he says, if you do tell me, you're going to get gifts and gold and treasures and all this kind of good stuff. And they're upset. They're like, the astrologers, in verse 10, it says, the astrologers answered the king, there's no one on earth who can do what the king asks. This is why God is so good. There's no one on earth, no king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of a magician, an enchanter, or an astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. Here's the verse. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they don't live among humans. So this is an assumption that they are making based on the gods that they know. Their gods don't dwell among people. That's not true of the God of Israel, right? So the God of Israel makes himself clearly known to the people that he chose, which is the nation of Israel, right? So he actually has a temple inside the kingdom with them so they can interact with him, right? He dwells among them. So what that line is saying actually isn't true for all gods. Whatever their gods are, that might be true for them, but that is not true of the God of the Israelites, right? So that's sort of like, in English, maybe we would call that foreshadowing, right? So that's something that we're going to see that helps us with this story. All right. So it says, this made the king so angry and furious, he ordered the execution of these wise men. The decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and the men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. So they were obviously in this category, and so everyone went out to kill all these men as well. Well, when they get to him, Arioch, when he gets to him, he says, Daniel spoke with wisdom and tact, and he asks. So once again, we see the beauty of, in some ways, the patience and the wisdom of Daniel, which is a God-given gift, right? God gave these things to these men. If you remember last time, Daniel asked if they could eat vegetables. Daniel didn't say, our God doesn't permit us, so we're not going to, right? He said, if you give me permission, the Lord is going to make us healthy, right? And we're going to be healthier than everybody else, right? Just check and see, right? So he's leaving it all at the feet of the Lord, and he's honoring the people and who he lives with, even though they're a wicked people. Do you see, what we are called to do, right? As those of us who put our faith and our trust in God, right? So we're called in some ways not to cater to things that make no sense, but to be honorable, to be compassionate, to be respectful, right? Those are things that I believe that we're called to do, right? We're called to obviously also bring truth and our faith to people. But so those are some of those things. So anyway, so he says, Daniel said, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? So he's not like, no, don't kill me. He's just asking the question. Why did he issue this? And so the guy tells him, it says, and then Daniel returns to the house. He explains the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then he urges them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven, not from the king, not from Arioch. He urges them to plead to the Lord, noting they are far away from the Lord at this point. They are enslaved in this house. Now they're living, some could say, relatively luxuriously, but they're not among their people. They are not in their land, their God-given land. That was taken by the people that they're with. So I want to be clear that sometimes even we can live in certain areas of prosperity, but if our God is not honored, right, it's a very hard place in which to live. So this was not easy for them. And so they didn't plead for mercy to this king that they showed respect to. What they did is they pled for mercy from the Lord, who they could have gone, the Lord is so far from us. He doesn't love us anymore. He doesn't want to be with us. He's destroyed us. There is no God, because obviously if he destroyed us, there is no God, right? They didn't do any of those things. They pled with the Lord, beating that to death. So there we go. And then it says, so we urge them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed. So, of course, they did want to save their lives, right? During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision, because Daniel can interpret dreams and visions. That was the gift that the Lord gave him. And then Daniel praises the God of heaven who showed him this. He says, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. So he asked, right? He asked God, right? They asked the Lord. The Lord answered. And then when the Lord answered, they praised the Lord. I want to be very clear. They didn't trust the Lord because he answered. They trusted him before he answered. They trusted him. They pled with him. He answered. They praised. So they weren't like, oh, now I really know who you are because you answered me. No. Then they were like, Lord, you are the most amazing, powerful, wonderful thing that has, right? They praised him. They lifted him up. They honored him and glorified him, right? He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness. You have given me wisdom and power, right? Like, I thank you. I give you praise. That's what they do afterwards. You see sort of like a pattern in this, I hope, in some of the ways that maybe we want to do that. Then it says in verse 24, Daniel goes to Arioch, right? And he says, don't execute these wise men. By the way, he says the wise men of Babylon. So he's not like, protect us, kill them, right? So he's like, don't execute these wise men. I'm going to come and I'm going to interpret his dream, right? So it's Daniel replies, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven. So he lays this at God's feet. It's not me. It's not my friends. Of course, these guys couldn't have told you that. There's no way these guys could have told you that. The only people, like what you asked in some ways was unfair, because those gods couldn't have told you, those enchanters couldn't have told you. The only thing that could have given you this answer is the Lord God in heaven, right? There is a God in heaven. He reveals mysteries. So here he goes. In verse 29, he says, as your majesty was lying there, I'm not going to give you this whole prophecy because it's a bit of a thing. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come. You looked, and before you, there stood a large statue. So this statue was gold, silver, bronze, iron, clay, right? So this big statue in front of you. So he says, and then this verse near I think in 36, it says, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So then you see this rock strikes it, starts to fall apart, and then the mountain fills the earth, right? So we see this big giant statue made of all different metals, rock strikes it, and it starts to crumble, and then this mountain fills the earth. So it says, this is the dream, and this is how we're going to interpret it. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. Absolutely. We can see it right there. He has placed all mankind and the beasts and everything under you. But after you, in verse 39, another kingdom's going to arise. Finally, there's going to be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks and smashes everything. So it's really strong. It's going to crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, this is going to be a divided kingdom. Is he talking about Israel? The divided kingdom? Or is he talking about Babylon? It's going to divide when everything starts to be crushed. Not too sure. Verse 44, it says, in the time of those kings, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor is it going to be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock. So the rock is the new kingdom that's going to endure forever. It says, the great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. So here's what we find out, right? Kingdom's going to break apart. A new kingdom's going to, right now it's super strong, but a new kingdom's going to break it apart. And then there's going to be a kingdom that breaks that and it's going to endure forever. It's going to be a mountain, which is how God represents himself, right? Always on the mountains, and a rock, and it's going to endure forever. So can we assume that this is Israel? I feel like we can assume that. Can I say that it's taken place? I'm going to say it has not. We don't see the kingdom of Israel enduring forever. It's still, even today, like actually today, it is a war-torn nation. So it says in verse 46, then the king fell prostrate before Daniel, and he said, an honoring of incense should be presented to him. And I think that's to Daniel. And then the king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries because of you. Do you see how Daniel showed the king who the Lord was, right? So again, I always say the Lord is showing himself everywhere to everyone. And this is one of those ways. Now, this guy chose to go, wow, that really was God. And some people choose not to say that that's God, right? Some people go, I don't care how many times you show me these things.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I'm going to come up with a new question that has no answer, and I'm going to come up with a new cynical retort, right? Like, so it is a matter of going, wow, that was really true, right? Like, how does that affect your heart, what they've done for you? I remember for me, and I'm going off on a tangent here, but I remember for me, I was not a believer, which I've shared in many of these videos, and I went to this program called MOPS, which is Moms of Preschoolers. And I wasn't a believer. I did not go to church. I was very against church. I was very against any kind of organized religion. But I wound up going to this because I was having a lot of problems at home, and it just was, everything was just really, really hard. Having little kids, I was not the best little kid mom, and having little kids was really, really challenging. And somebody said, hey, you should come to this mom thing that I have at church. It is not about church, right? But it is about just bringing moms together that have kids, right? We all have similarities, and you'll get to hear like positive words and all these kind of things. So I wound up going, and it was a while, but I wound up going, and I didn't love it at first, but then I wound up loving it afterwards. And I remember hearing the testimonies of all these people, right? People would stand up, and in my mind, I kept going, that could have just been because of this, and that could have just been because of that, and that could have just been, right? Like all of these things. And then I got pregnant and I had my youngest child. And when I had my third kid, for weeks, they all brought me food. If you know me, you know I love food. And not having to cook I had two other young babies at home and a brand new baby that just came home. And to not have to cook and make a meal and have these women just bringing me like casserole, like some, and it was all different. Some brought me bread, some brought me casseroles, some brought me like just, you know what, just have some frozen meals that you can just throw in, you know, the oven and forget about it, right? Like they brought me all kinds of different things. To see that level of compassion and care from people that like I didn't know that well. I knew a little bit, but I didn't know that well. And to see that they recognized the rough time that I was going to have, and they loved the Lord, and because they loved the Lord, they showed that love to me through bringing me food. And for me, that was like boom, like that was like one of those moments where it clicks, right? Like these things click for you, and you want to just experience what they're experiencing. Like, why is this happening? Ultimately, what I'm saying is that actions matter, right? So the things we do count in the grand scheme of things. So, okay, so he wants to give many gifts to him, right? And then he says in verse 49, moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, those are their names that they were given. Administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court, right? So now everybody's got jobs in the kingdom. All the people, well, the four that are following the Lord, right? Okay, so moving on to Daniel 3, King Nebuchadnezzar then makes an image of gold. So we're going into sort of a different story. So he makes this image of gold, which means he's making an image of himself. And so once he makes this image of himself, it says he's sending for everybody for the dedication of this image. So now he makes this beautiful, huge gold image of himself. He brings all of his people in to dedicate themselves to it, right? And then it says, everybody assembles. And it says, when then the herald loudly proclaims, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of the gold king, right? Of the gold king Nebuchadnezzar. Whoever doesn't is going to be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. Okay, so they've been given a decree, essentially worship King Nebuchadnezzar. When it comes down to it, we find out that Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are unable to do that because they only worship the Lord, their God, right? So some astrologers come forward and they denounce them. Now, was there bad blood between them? Were they trying to honor God or their own gods? Were they trying to honor Nebuchadnezzar as God? We don't know any of that information. But what we do know is they went and they complained about them. Verse 12, it says, there's some Jews who you have sent over the affairs of the province of Babylon, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They don't serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up. So he's furious. And he brings them to him and he says, what God's going to be able to rescue you from my hand? Because you're supposed to worship me. Who do you think's going to come to your rescue? Shouldn't you know that? I don't know. Maybe it's been a while, a couple years. I don't know. Doesn't say. So the three guys reply, listen, we don't need to defend ourselves. So again, here's another way a beautiful way that we can honor the Lord, right? Showing how good the Lord is. The God we serve is able to deliver us from that blazing furnace. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. So what they have done is they have made it, essentially there's a line that they're not going to cross, no matter what happens to their person. Sorry, I always have to check my mic. So no matter what happens to them, and these are the kinds of things that I feel like in some ways God honors, right? Because obviously he also wanted to show himself to the people and the king. But he honors these things. They're not expecting him to do it. All they expect is that they say, we worship the Lord, and that's the only God we're going to worship. That's their only expectation. And nothing else matters. Whether they live, whether they die, whether they're tortured, whether they're demoted, whether they lose all their money, none of that is on their radar. The only thing that matters is that they can only worship the Lord, their God. So do you see where their hearts are set? Obviously, what happens is their hearts are set in this way, and then actions follow. So here I go again with the same thing, right? Like actions are important. We see these guys doing actions. Then Nebuchadnezzar's furious. He orders the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. So he's like, there's no way. So hot that when the people come and bring these 3 guys up to the furnace, they actually die. They get caught in the fire and they die. But these 3 guys go in, and when these 3 guys go in, King Nebuchadnezzar sees a 4th person in there with them. Nothing happens to them. They come out. So this is one of those miracles, right? Here we go with full, like we don't need to guess. Did the Red Sea part? We don't need to make any guesses. They went into a fire. They came out completely unscathed. Could we say, well, obviously the where they were in there, they were protected, or like whatever. We love making excuses over this, or we love saying these different things instead of just accepting that God has given these guys a miracle for Nebuchadnezzar to see, for this to be experienced all through time, right? So he does this full miracle. Then Nebuchadnezzar says, praise be to the gods of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of these 3 be cut into pieces and their houses be turned to piles of rubble, for no other God can save this way. Then the king promoted those 3 into the province of Babylon. So here we go again. They got rewarded. God got honored. People were meant to now protect this God. All right, we're going to move on to Jeremiah. So we're going to go a little bit lower here. We've got a little bit in Jeremiah to do, essentially just one chapter. So it says Jeremiah speaks at the temple. Remember, Jeremiah is another prophet. God comes to Jeremiah and he says, go speak this out. And by the way, we've seen that Jeremiah is sort of like, woe to me. Everyone keeps coming against me. Everyone's assaulting me. So Jeremiah It seems like Daniel, I'm not saying he has it great, but it doesn't seem like he's kind of accosted all the time. Jeremiah seems like he is. So Jeremiah seems to have it rough. They say, stand at the gate at the temple and then shout these things out to these people. So essentially, go in front of your church and tell your church they're doing it all wrong. See how that works out for you, right? Not even, I shouldn't even just say, maybe I take it back. Don't tell them they're all wrong. Tell them they are defiling this church and they are dishonoring God. And that destruction is coming on them because of it, right? And see what happens. It's not going to go well. Okay, so he says, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates. This is what the God says. Reform your ways and your actions. Simple. Stop doing what you're doing. Turn back to me. Reform your ways and your actions. Worse is going to come on you if you don't reform your ways and your actions, right? And so he says this, he repeats this to the people. And then he says, has this house, in verse 11, has this house which bears my name become a den of robbers to you? So they're making it, it's like they're making it a den of robbers. He says, but I've been watching. Go now to the palace in Shiloh where I first made a dwelling for my name and see what I did. Go look and see what I did up there in Shiloh. I destroyed them. So go look and go check that out because that's what's coming for you. And then he says to Jeremiah, don't pray for these people. Don't offer any petition. Don't offer any sacrifices. So like now it is no longer in the prophets and the priests' hands. It is in the people. Are they going to turn to the Lord? They have been warned. They have been told. Are they going to do it or aren't they? No one's going to stand up on their behalf because they've already done that, right? Jeremiah has already pleaded with them. Prophets have come. And he's like, you've killed all the prophets that have come, right? You're now offering to the Queen of Heaven. Who is that? You're offering to the Queen of Heaven. You're putting your kids, you're sacrificing your kids in the fire, right? And he says, my wrath's going to be poured out on this place. And he says, I gave them this command. So he says, reminding them all the way back, and I wanted to point this out because I think this hits us as well. I didn't just give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices. So he's like, you guys who are coming with your, again, if I equate it to us today, you guys, I go to church every Sunday, but I offer my tithing every Sunday. That's not, right? That's not it. That's a teeny tiny portion of it, but that's not it, right? What he says is, he says, I gave them this command, obey me. Obey me, and I'll be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in obedience to all I command you. That's what he wants us to do. And then in verse 27, it says, when you tell them all of this, he's talking to Jeremiah, they're not going to listen to you. When you call to them, they're going to answer. Therefore, say to them, this is the nation that has not obeyed the Lord or responded to correction. Truth has perished and vanished from their lips. Then he says to Jeremiah, cut off your hair, throw it away, and take up a lament. Again, so sad, so bad for Jeremiah. Cut off all your hair, take up a lament. So you're like, woe is sad, and this is awful, and these horrible things, right? So he's going to take a lament. For the Lord has rejected and abandoned this generation. Once again, he says, it didn't even enter my mind all the disgusting things that you're going to do, which I find really interesting. He says, so I'm going to destroy you. Once again, we're going to be calling this a valley of slaughter, which I've already talked about. He said, I'm going to bring an end to the sounds of joy and gladness, to the voices of bride and bridegroom, the towns of Judah, because this land is going to be desolate. At that time, the bones of everybody, like there was a time, so there was this tradition that held that they would be buried with the bones of their father, that they would, right? That, so like there was this continual connection to community even after death. And now he's like, I'm just going to leave all those bones. They're going to be like dung all over the place. So even your bones are not going to get honored because of all that you have done. And that's how he's ending today. It says, all the survivors of this evil nation will prefer death to life, declares the Lord Almighty. That is the last thing that he's saying in this particular prophecy. And so we're going to see where he starts us tomorrow. That's the end for today. So I appreciate if you guys stuck with me. If you have and you found it a blessing, I want you to like it. I want you to subscribe to the channel, share it with people, because I want people reading their Bibles, right? Getting into their Bibles and learning to love the Lord. Keep reading, guys, and I will see you next time.